All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Neha Singera, and I'm the Policy Director at Berkeley Food Institute. BFI is a research, policy, and education institute housed in UC Berkeley. We leverage UC resources in partnership with communities to shape a just food and farming system. Today's webinar is the fourth and final of BFI's fall webinar series, where we connect policy and research to explore key issues shaping our food and farming system. This past fall, our webinars featured researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on topics ranging from ultra-processed foods to the California Farm to School grant evaluation to antitrust and competition in the food system. You can view the recordings of these webinars on BFI's YouTube channel. Our spring webinar series will kick off in January, and you can learn more about these topics that will be covered by subscribing to the BFI newsletter. And now for today's webinar on soil carbon and climate solutions in agriculture. Two defining challenges for California agriculture are the accelerating impacts of climate change and the goal to sustain one of the world's most productive agricultural systems. As the state experiences more extreme heat, drought, and increasingly volatile weather, it has become clear that climate resilience will be greatly impacted by how we manage our landscapes, our soils, and the biological processes that support our food system. Soil health and carbon sequestration offer an important lens for thinking about climate solutions. Healthy soils store more carbon, retain water more effectively, support biodiversity, and can improve resilience of agricultural system in the face of changing climate and water constraints. Practices like cover cropping, compost application, biochar, and other nature-based approaches can not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also improve the functioning of working lands. They also connect directly to the broader themes of circularity, how we use organic byproducts, reduce waste, and reinvest those materials back into our farms and rangelands. These practices connect directly to California's climate resilience strategy and to statewide targets for nature-based solutions. They also speak to a larger question of how agriculture can be a part of the solution of addressing climate change while continuing to feed communities, support livelihoods, and sustain economies. Today's webinar invites us to examine these questions both through the scientific and policy perspectives. Today's panelists are experts on this topic. Rebecca Ryals is an associate professor at UC Merced and leads the Agroecology Lab. Her research focuses on ecosystem-based climate solutions in agriculture. A major theme of her research is the capture, transformation, and beneficial reuse of organic wastes as resources to rebuild soil carbon and contribute to a more productive and just food system. Virginia Jameson is the Deputy Secretary for Climate and Working Lands at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. She leads CDFA's work on climate change, including the development of the state's climate resilience strategy for agriculture and the implementation of Proposition 4, which is California's $10 billion climate bond, which passed in 2024. For today's webinar, we will have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So for folks tuning in, please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you don't need to wait until the end of the webinar to ask your questions. Welcome, Virginia and Rebecca. And with that, I will pass it over to Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Neha, for the invitation. Thank you for Virginia. I'm excited to hear from you as well during the session, and I'm pleased to share this space with you all here today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some examples of how we do research in this space, thinking about our agricultural systems as a climate solution with a particular focus on soil carbon and soil health. Just a brief introduction. The work that I'm presenting here is hugely collaborative, both within my group and others across other institutions. But also the farmers that we work with, nonprofit organizations, cooperative extension, and other resource conservation districts and others. So really a team effort, but we try to do work in agroecology, thinking about agriculture as a climate solution. Some of our core strengths are listed on the left. If you're ever interested in connecting, we always love to make connections with a wide network of people to share knowledge. So to just give us all the same foundation, I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on some of the main points here that we need to consider when we're thinking about agriculture as a climate solution. The first is just this global carbon cycle. We know that the global carbon cycle has been perturbed by human actions, in particular, burning of fossil fuels, which are this big gray bar coming out of the earth into the atmosphere, that has put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere over a relatively short time in Earth's history. About half of that impact has been buffered naturally by our soils, vegetation, and oceans that have taken up about half of that carbon that we've put into the atmosphere. So we already know that our landscapes are an important reservoir, and a dynamic reservoir for carbon exchanging with the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of power in managed landscapes, and natural landscapes to be protected, conserved, or managed in a way that really leverages the ability of plants and soils to take carbon from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil in more protected pools and biological pools that interact and have all of those benefits that Neha just mentioned as well. So we're going to focus more on these green. The green dots are the pools, so how much carbon is in there, and then the arrows show those net fluxes from the atmosphere and the land. So soils store a lot of carbon. They're easy to not appreciate as much as we do because they're dirt, but they're lovely dirt. So soils actually store more carbon than all of the vegetation on Earth and all of the atmospheric carbon as well combined. So we already know that it's a huge reservoir of carbon on Earth. We also know that it's dynamic, and we have the power to either increase or decrease that already large pool of carbon. Unfortunately, we've incurred quite a large soil carbon debt because of management, land use change and management, especially revolving around modern agriculture. So this is a figure from John Sanderman that shows the increase in land use area that's used for agriculture over time over the last 12,000 years or so, or sorry, 2,000 years or so. And then the soil carbon loss that parallels it. And this is a number of different practices that basically reduce the soil health of the soil, physical and chemical and biological properties of the soil that we're trying to kind of restore. And we know that the soil carbon interacts with the atmosphere. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has risen sharply over a short time, both due to fossil fuel combustion and land use change, including land use for agriculture. The future is really up to us. We know that if we continue on the path as usual, concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide will continue to rise. Reducing emissions, whether those are emissions from fossil fuel burning or from land emissions of things like nitrous oxide, are an important part of that climate solution, but they're not the only part. And so the focus here today is thinking about soil carbon that can provide a drawdown climate solution. By managing our agricultural systems, we can basically leverage the ability of plants to photosynthesize, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting it into roots, feeding the microbiome of the soil, and leading to a healthier, more protected way to store that carbon. But again, it is dynamic, and so our soil carbon can be vulnerable or persistent depending on how we're managing it. And we can think about that soil carbon pool as a bank account, just the balance of outputs and inputs. If we have more outputs through respiration of carbon, loss of the carbon back to the atmosphere, then we're going to have soil carbon loss in a particular place. And if we implement strategies to increase inputs of carbon into the soil, then we can have a buildup of soil carbon. It's a complicated story, though. We know a lot about soil carbon already, but our knowledge is changing quite rapidly. And so it's really in the last 15 years or so that soil science has experienced this big paradigm shift in the basic of understanding of how soil carbon persists in the soil. We used to think that soil carbon or soil organic matter was the end product of decomposition, mostly the decomposition of above ground plant litter, that it was this chemical process that would stabilize carbon. We know now that the story is a lot more complex than that, which makes it both fun and exciting, but also challenging when you're trying to implement climate solutions and do careful accounting of carbon. So we know that roots play a big impact. We know that microbes are the key to building soil health and carbon storage. And we know that there's not an inherent recalcitrant or unbreakable carbon bond, that it's really this combination of physical protection, microbial mechanisms, and biological processes that help to sequester that carbon. So we used to think that there was this humus, this old recalcitrant end product of decomposition. Now we know that nothing's really inherently recalcitrant. And so that the tools that we have now to study carbon are not just things like bulk soil carbon measurements, but we also do things like fractionate the soil carbon into physically protected pools so that we can understand if the carbon that we're measuring is the more fast turning over carbon that's in a pool that we call particulate organic matter, or if it's in a slower, more protected, physically protected aggregates or this mineral associated organic matter pool, which might have lifetimes of 10 decades or even thousands of years. So the type of carbon we know matters, and the ecosystem properties that protect it matter. Soil carbon is also not only scientifically an interesting field of study, but we know that it's a core part of soil health. Soil health, as defined by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, is the continued capacity of soils to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. At the heart of all of the practices or principles underlying soil health is soil carbon. Soil health can't be measured by one thing alone. So usually we use a suite of indicators, biological, physical, and chemical indicators. There's just a few listed here on the slide. There's many others that we can think about. But soil carbon really integrates all of those things because it has physical properties of the soil by doing things like decreasing bulk density. It's a biological component because it provides that energy source for microorganisms, and it interacts with soil chemistry because it provides exchange sites for nutrients, among other things. So we know soil carbon is key to the climate story, but it's also key to overall soil health that is important for agricultural sustainability. I'm going to focus, I should say there's many different ways that we can do research or implement soil health practices that also increase soil carbon. The examples that I'm going to show today are the use of organic matter amendments. And so I'll just say also that there's a wide variety of different organic matter amendments that can be applied to soil. Things like manure, which can have really labile or readily available nutrients, and all the way to the other end of the spectrum, that things like biochar that has a lot of carbon but very little nitrogen. And so the different properties of the organic amendments can have impacts on readily available nutrients, long-term carbon storage, water retention, and a host of other things that you might want to understand. And context matters also. Because of that soil organic matter as an ecosystem property, we know that how that organic matter amendment is applied, how often, the method of application, for example, is it surface applied or injected, those are all going to interact with that complex story of soil carbon persistence. And added on to that, you have diverse agroecosystems with different soil types, mineralogies, different climates, different baseline conditions, different plants growing there, and the element of time. So if you're looking at responses after 1 year versus after 50 years, you might see a different story. So with that, I'm just going to highlight a few projects that we did kind of a deep dive in these, and really just highlighting the key findings, but happy to talk more detail about anything. The first is the Merced Carbon Project, which was a study that got started in 2008 when I was a PhD student in Wendy Silver's lab at UC Berkeley. We and our partners looked at the impacts of a one-time application of compost to rangelands at 2 sites in California, in a valley grassland and a coastal grassland. And we have a number of papers that look at all aspects of that. So I'll point you to the website if you want to get into the science of it, or feel free to reach out to me. But the punchline here is that after a one-time application of compost in these rangelands, we saw an increase of almost 9 megagrams of carbon per hectare 10 years after that one-time application of compost. So that that carbon wasn't from the carbon in the compost just sticking around and being inert and just staying there. Instead, it was a function of the whole ecosystem. We saw increases in root biomass, increases in above ground forage production, improvements in aggregation, that physical protection of carbon into more protected pools rather than fast cycling pools. So this is a pretty big response, and given the scale of rangelands across California, about 40% of California's land area is rangelands, a huge potential to leverage some of those rangelands for soil carbon sequestration and having added benefits of increased water retention and increased forage production. We also looked at a life cycle assessment, and we found that there were life cycle benefits to increasing soil carbon at the ecosystem scale, and also especially from avoiding landfill emissions of methane when that organic material is diverted from landfills. We've now replicated this study across multiple sites throughout the state. CDFA also has included compost application to agricultural systems in their Healthy Soils program, so others have also replicated this to really get at that complex context portion of it as well. So we'll have more results forthcoming from longer-term studies of replicated across the state. But in a global analysis that we published a few years ago, we see that compost, regardless of feedstock type or application rate, across many studies, increased forage production above ground and increased all the metrics of below ground carbon, including roots, soil organic carbon, microbial biomass, and others. So we do see at a global scale across many studies, many different contexts, similar kinds of findings, as well as increases in things like water retention, aggregation, and nutrient availability. In this global meta-analysis and in the Marine Carbon Project, we saw little to no effect on plant diversity, which was a concern at the start of the project when you're adding a material that's also going to bring nitrogen. A concern was that it would increase invasive species, but in this case, and in the case of the meta-analysis, we didn't see that happening. Another piece of research that I wanted to highlight is our current work in orchards, done in partnership with our colleagues at UC Davis and East Stanislaus Resource Conservation District. And here we're using compost in orchards, which are a very different system than rangelands because they're more intensively managed. They have perennial trees on them. And oftentimes in conventional practice have bare understory, bare vegetation in the understory. And so in this case, we tested compost in synergy with other soil health practices. So in 8 orchards throughout the Central Valley, we added annual additions of compost and also annual additions of cover crop seeding. These two soil health practices have some overlapping benefits. For example, they both might increase nitrogen availability because compost has nitrogen in it that slowly mineralizes and is released into the soil. And some of the cover crops are nitrogen fixers like the faba beans. So they could both be an additional source of nitrogen input into the system. But they also have different effects as well. So compost being that big immediate source of organic matter that can kind of kickstart the biological part of the soil. And the cover crops can do things like increase porosity of the soil, attract pollinators, and have some other interactions with the soil biology that compost might not have. So here we really looked at compost in synergy with other soil health practices. We measured pretty much as many soil health indicators as we could. Again, those chemical, biological, and physical soil health indicators. I'm just going to point out a few that I think are relevant broadly, but just to say that across the board, all of these soil health indicators increased, although it took a little bit of time. So after the first year of the study, we really didn't see changes in many things that we measured at all. And it wasn't until the second year we started to see some changes. And then by year 3, we really started seeing the system look quite different than it did in year 1. So these things can take a little bit of time. Just a couple examples of the responses. We saw that when we add cover crops and compost, those orchards had significantly higher soil moisture throughout the soil profile. That also translated to reduced tree stress in some of the orchards that we can measure with dendrometers as well. We also saw that adding compost, which are the brown bars show when the compost was added each year. When the compost was added, it had an immediate effect on the plant available nitrogen in the soil, mostly in the form of ammonium, but that level of ammonium was sustained throughout the growing season. So that kind of points to the fact that compost is the slow release fertilizer that's going to sustain the nitrogen source throughout the growing season. Whereas the conventional practice used synthetic fertilizers, so we see a little bit more spike up in nitrogen availability and then flatlining again pretty immediately afterwards. We also, just like in the Marine Carbon Project, also in this context, saw an increase in soil organic carbon storage. This shows soil carbon from the conventional in orange and the soil health practice plots in green. The berms and the alleys are the two different dotted and solid lines. And we saw that the cover crop and compost plots increased soil carbon storage by over 100% compared over the 3 years compared to just a 37% increase in the conventional system. Now, these are pretty low carbon systems to begin with, but this shows that over a relatively short time, you can see pretty significant increases in the carbon storage capacity of these soils. We are now also scaling this up across kind of as a survey site, looking at 30 different orchards across the San Joaquin Valley that are managed along the spectrum of conventional to regenerative. Conventional, again, having more bare soils underneath. In this intermediate space, having one or two things happen, like cover crops and composting, and then regenerative orchards that stack many, many more soil health practices. So there's composting, there's cover crops, there's grazing animals, there's reduced fertilizer and irrigation efficiency, and all sorts of other things. So really maximizing the kind of regenerative management practices. And again, this was replicated across the San Joaquin Valley from the northern to southern regions, and within each of those regions having these kind of like triplicates coupled throughout them. This research is undergoing now, so I don't have much to show you, but I can give you a quick preview of the percent of soil carbon across these conventional and intermediate and regenerative sites. And across this wide spectrum of sites which has different soil types and all sorts of management differences, we see a very strong impact of these regenerative soil practices on soil carbon. And this indicates to me that there's lots that we can do, by adding one or two practices, we can bump up soil carbon. But this is not a linear increase. So the more regenerative practices that are practiced, the bigger the benefit is. It's a little bit more of a multiplier. And then in kind of the last case study I wanted to share is kind of scaling up to multiple agricultural systems and thinking about the role of compost and soil as a climate solution and fostering a circular bioeconomy. So as an example here, we have orchard prunings. It's a lot of biomass, a lot of woody biomass every year. For a long time, the conventional practice was to burn them in the open. That results in a lot of air pollution, which is a concern for folks like myself who live in the Central Valley. And there is a new law that that bans open burning of almond pruning. So farmers now have to figure out what to do with that vast amount of woody material. And then we can also couple almonds with dairies, which are also pretty present in the Central Valley. Dairy manure is often managed in lagoons or are stockpiled, and in those contexts, it produces a lot of nitrous oxide and methane emissions. And then crops that are grown to feed cattle rely a lot on synthetic fertilizers or raw manure, really leaky sources of nitrogen that can result in nitrate leaching or nitrous oxide emissions if not managed in the most efficient ways. So in these current linear structures, we're thinking about these agricultural systems in isolation, and the result is a burden to the environment and also to the communities living around these systems. If we break those boxes up a little bit for thinking about a more of a circularity approach, we can look at the waste products of each of those as a resource for and an input for the next system. So the work that we did was making biochar through pyrolysis out of almond shells. Biochar, if you're not familiar with, is a charcoal-like substance that has a lot of really great properties like high surface area, porosity, a lot of habitat and exchange sites for nutrients and water. We know a lot about it because of the indigenous use of biochar, leading to high soil fertility in tropical areas where you might expect low inherent soil fertility because of the weathering of that soil. In this case, we're using that biochar, coupling it with dairy manure that's been anaerobically digested. The digestion produces methane, which is captured for energy, and the solid material is then composted. When it's composted with biochar, we see significant reductions in methane emissions, volatile organic compounds, and bad odors. And then when that biochar co-compost is applied to crop production, we see an increase in nitrogen use efficiency and higher crop yields. So, and then that can cycle back to the other systems. So that's one example of a circular bioeconomy that really leverages these waste streams as resources for another part of agriculture. This is just a bit of a schematic about it, showing some of the impacts that we've measured that have an impact on local air quality and global climate change. And I'd like to show this picture on the left, which is these dairy manure co-composts. The white ring is part of our gas sampling. And at the bottom is the figure without biochar added, and all of those flies are cattle pests. So they're attracted to bad smells, and this was a good data point for us, and the reason why we added another study to measure volatile organic compounds as well. Composting is, a great climate practice that increases soil health and carbon storage in many agricultural contexts. It can also feed to that biocircular economy, but there are challenges and incentives. So one incentive is a new law called SB 1383, which requires a significant diversion of organic waste from landfills. And that's thought to, the primary use for that will be composting. Estimates are that we need about 75 to 100 new composting facilities. And that can be hard to meet because large-scale composting does produce air pollutants, which can be a burden for local communities. And so this is a great paper by Brendan Harrison that was published last year that looks at compost facility site suitability. There's lots of candidate sites for composting facilities, but you have to take into account both proximity to working lands that could use that material to reduce transportation and also the communities around that environment. And so in the Central Valley in particular, we really feel that small decentralized composting facilities are a key part of meeting SB 1383 and increasing soil health and carbon storage in our agricultural systems. And so I'll just also briefly mention this new collaboration that we have with several different community organizations in the San Joaquin Valley called the Central Valley Community Compost. And we're basically working with small farmers, tribal communities, food banks, and others to implement composting at small scales as a way to increase carbon storage, increase soil fertility, and increase local food production, and lower the burden of meeting SB 1383 in these communities as well. And with that, just wanted to mention, soil is this large dynamic reservoir of carbon. We've incurred this carbon debt. We're still understanding some of the basics of how carbon cycles in soil. So it's a fascinating field of work. We do know enough to act on that. And one example of that is using compost in different agroecosystems and stacking that with other soil health practices to get maximum benefits and potential to do that at large and small scales. And with that, I will hand it over to Virginia so that we can learn more about the policy levers.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ryals, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen without struggling as hard as I did in the practice session. Here we go. Let's see. Okay, can you see the correct version of my slides?
Yeah, that looks great, Virginia.
Excellent, thank you. So again, hi, I'm Virginia Jameson, Deputy Secretary for Climate and Working Lands in California. I work for the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and I'm going to start with a little bit of context about California agriculture, just to kind of give you an idea of, the variety and diversity of the agriculture that we're working with when we're thinking about how to implement some of these solutions. So again, about 40 million acres in California. You can see information from our Department of Conservation's farmland mapping and monitoring on the right that kind of shows you the different types. So the green is irrigated farmland, and then in that kind of yellow tan color, there's dry land and grazing land. And so you can see it's a just really huge opportunity potentially to implement some of these solutions. Ag in California consists of about 63,000 farms. Unfortunately, we lost 10% of those farms after 2017, probably a little bit more at this point. And those were primarily small farms. And that's because there is a very difficult situation in agriculture right now with decreasing prices for crops, increasing costs of inputs, costs of labor up. There are tariffs, there are all kinds of pressures going on, and it's making it very difficult for folks. So that's a little bit of background for, as we're trying to ask people to try these new things, we also are trying to consider that they're dealing with all these other pressures as well. The average farm size in California is 383 acres. That is much smaller than the national average of farm size. We tend to have a little bit smaller farms in California because we grow what we call specialty crops, which for the most part are not corn, wheat, and soy like it's grown in the rest of the country. So about 60% of our farms are under 50 acres and 30% of them are under 10 acres. A lot of folks drive up and down the state on I-5 or 99 and they see what look like big giant farms, and we do have some big giant farms in California, but the reality is that most of them are small and most of them are not pulling in a ton of income either. So about half the farms make under $25,000, which means people typically have other jobs or their spouse has another job that's supporting the operation. And it's only about those top 30% that make over $100,000. We do have a very vast diversity of crops in California. We grow over 400 crops and commodities. That's really different than the rest of the country as well. So, all of those leafy greens and nuts and grapes and dairy products that we all enjoy, we grow them all over the state. And the most recent count we have is that we brought in about $60 billion in 2024. Okay, so that's some context for you. Okay, so I'm also going to talk to you about this idea of nature-based solutions in agriculture, and that's because we've set these nature-based solutions targets. So I wanted to give you some context for what we mean by that. Nature-based solutions, kind of writ large, is this idea of using or amplifying things in nature to kind of improve our environment and address climate change. So within agriculture, that might encompass practices that have been used for, since time immemorial, from practices from traditional ecological knowledge, which might include like burning or things like that. And then there are things that we've kind of conceptualized more recently as conservation agriculture practices, like Dr. Ryals talked about, like composting, cover cropping, installing hedgerows, things that we would also kind of bucket as these healthy soils practices. So you're going to hear me use some of these terms somewhat interchangeably, but not completely. So we take the view that nature-based solutions in agriculture can help improve resilience while fighting climate change, enhancing farmer livelihoods, conserving biodiversity, and increasing carbon sequestration. So back in 2024 on Earth Day, the state established a set of nature-based solutions targets, and these were for all landscape types in California. I'm just going to focus today on croplands and grasslands because they're relevant to agriculture, but we also set them for things like wetlands and forests and things like that. So we have set these targets, which I believe are both very ambitious and not ambitious enough in some ways. So we've set these targets for increasing the acreage of healthy soils practices. And you can see we've got some benchmark years, and those benchmark years were set in the legislation that required us to set these targets. So for 2030, 2038, and 2045. And so between the years of 2030 to 2038, we're doing 140,000 additional acres of healthy soils practices each year. So it's all supposed to build on each other. And so this would result in about 3 million acres of additional healthy soils practice managed farmland by 2045. And that would be about 35% of the farmland. There's some other targets listed in here I'm not going to focus on as much, but we'd like to also see conservation of annual and perennial croplands. This is because we are trying to address issues like sprawl development. And then we've also set a target for conversion to organic systems, resulting in 20% organic by 2045. And that's also going to be very challenging. So for grasslands, similarly, we've set these targets of 33,000 acres per year additional treatment, so restoration, including restoring native vegetations, adding soil amendments like the compost that Dr. Ryals showed in the Marine Carbon Project, prescribed grazing, things like that. And I failed to write down the total numbers that would equal at the end, so I'm sorry about that. But we do have this document online, so if you want to see all of the numbers, we can get you that. Okay, so how are we supporting our transition to hopefully more healthy soils and nature-based solutions? So the state has a program called the Healthy Soils Program, probably focus on this one the most. It's been operating since 2018. And what we do is provide direct incentives to farmers, essentially small grants to adopt practices like, again, cover cropping, compost application, which is our most popular one. And then there's a suite of 27 different, actually it might be 28 now, because we did just add biochar as a potential practice you could do. So we're asking folks to try these practices out for 3 years. I was very relieved to hear Dr. Ryals say that's when you start seeing some of the benefits, because the state hasn't had enough money to ask people, to pay people to do this forever. So we're really hoping that people will try this out, have some dollars to take the edge off the additional cost and time that some of this can take, reduce the risk of trying a new thing that could be scary for people, and hopefully by the end of the grant start to see some of the benefits, like that improved nutrient management and better crop outcomes. So with healthy soils, that's probably our biggest one. We've done about 3,000 projects on about 300,000 acres to date, and we've got a little bit more money through Proposition 4 for that. So you might see grants becoming available. We've had also a number of programs that have been, in some cases, funded more than once, and in some cases, one-off. So a pollinator habitat program, which again kind of incentivizes people to use healthy soils practices, but that also have pollinator benefits. So those hedgerows, flowering cover crops, things that are going to support pollinators on farm. We had a program called the Conservation Agriculture Planning Grant Program, and that gave people the opportunity to work with technical assistance providers to do some on-farm planning and think about how what actions they could take on their farms, and like really plan out, like, okay, if I do this practice, if I install this water efficiency equipment, et cetera, like what will my farm look like, and what are the steps that I need to take to get there? I'm going to skip farm to school for a second. We also have alternative manure management, which includes composting of manure so that it can, later be used in the ways Dr. Ryals talked about, technical assistance program, and then goes along with all of these things. And then going back to farm to school for a second, that program works to connect farms with school districts and their local area so that not only are kids getting to eat fresh, nutritious produce, but we're also trying to create more local, hopefully more stable markets for producers of climate smart grown or healthy soils grown products. And we do prioritize producers who use those techniques when we're making those connections. And I believe in the last year we had 100% of the farmers that we connected with schools using climate smart or healthy soils practices. We also had a program funding organic transition, which again, like is usually a stacking of healthy soils practices. And then we've begun to delve into below ground biodiversity, which, I know we know some things, that I also understand that there's a lot that we don't know. So we have a number of ways we're trying to support these things. I think we could always use more funding. If anyone in the legislature is listening, because we have these really high acreage goals. And as I said, we've probably hit about 300,000 acres so far. So moving on, I also wanted to just riff off Dr. Ryals a little bit, talking about SB 1383. We have, this is also a globally ambitious methane reduction goal. This is the most ambitious methane reduction goal in the world, actually. And the organic waste to compost is a big part of that. There's also a big part of it that's about reducing methane from livestock manure and livestock enteric emissions, which is a whole other thing. And we've also started to really lean on this idea of the circular bioeconomy. Like, what other things can we be doing with our waste biomass, or what we would have called waste in the past, which is really shouldn't be thought of as waste, in my opinion. So, ideally, we'd better mimic natural ecosystem processes where nothing goes to waste. And there are things that farmers have been doing for a long time, like, incorporating crop residues back into their soils, putting manure back on the soil. But now we have opportunities with more technology like those anaerobic digesters that turn waste back into fertilizers and energy. We have uses for biomass, like creating things like plastic replacements, dyes, textiles, building materials. And the reason this is really important, and is really important to California agriculture today, is that we're experiencing kind of this confluence of events where we've phased out ag burning in much of the state. Dr. Ryals mentioned that. But we also have changing consumer tastes. For example, people are drinking less wine. We have these kind of, global market forces at work. We have tariffs. And so suddenly California is experiencing a lot of excess, especially woody biomass, as people are removing vines, removing trees. And since those things can't be burned anymore, which is the cheapest way of getting rid of it, there's a lot of woody biomass to dispose of, and people are really looking for solutions. And so that includes work that the Department of Food and Ag is doing with an entity called Beam Circular, just trying to conceptualize all the things that we can do to use this biomass and also scale it up, which of course includes reinvestment in the soil. So finally, I will end with the project that I've been working on for the past couple of years, which is a climate resilient strategy for California agriculture. And this is a strategy that we've been trying to lay out to kind of show the ways that the state is supporting a resilient food system in the face of climate change. And it covers all of these topics. So it's been a big undertaking because we at CDFA don't necessarily manage water or energy or some of these other things. So we've had to do kind of a cross government effort to talk about all of the different programs and things that are happening. So we just closed the public comment period on November 21st. I know some of you here, I saw on the participant list have submitted comments to us. Thank you so much. So we are now taking those comments and integrating them, and hopefully what we'll end up with is a strategy that really shares what California agriculture needs to become resilient to climate change. So I think I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Virginia and Rebecca. Those were extremely insightful presentations. I forgot we were on a webinar. I was learning so much. So we've got some good questions in the chat. And again, I encourage folks that have joined us to drop your questions in the chat. We have about 15 minutes to do Q&A. There's two questions here that focus on compost. So I will ask Rebecca to comment on this. The first question has to do with what is the source of compost and composting processes? Could different compost sources, such as industrial municipal versus on-farm versus more passive compost production, change the soil responses? And the second question has to do with the standard for compost. So are there certain organic wastes that make better compost? And are there specific things that can be included to make them the optimal compost? And how does this also impact responses in soil? Rebecca, I welcome you to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. These are questions that my lab group thinks a lot about. And so for the first part, the source of compost for the Marin Carbon project was more of a green waste. It was an organic certified compost that was really important for one of the ranches that we worked with, that their ranch was organic certified. And then for the orchard, that was more manure based, because that's readily available in the quantities that we needed it at the time we needed it. And it's, close by to the orchards. So sometimes the decision for what kind of compost that we use in a particular study is science-based, because we want to compare different C to N ratios and how they relate to one another. And then sometimes for our studies, it's practical, like what would the farmer use and why, whether that's distance or particular values that they have. And then the kind of the second part is does it matter if the compost is different, right? Because it's composts, it could have different qualities. And the short answer is yes, for sure. And so the optimal compost really just depends on the goals that farmer has. If one of the goals, if you're an organic farmer and you're using it as a source of nitrogen, then you might want to have a compost that has a lower C to N ratio, so more of that nitrogen is more readily available, or can more quickly mineralize, rather than tying up nitrogen. So sometimes it might be a decision based on nutrient availability, and then that would be kind of looking at more of the elemental properties of the compost. And then sometimes it might be a more of aesthetic thing. So we're working with cities on urban turf grass, for example. These are recreational soccer fields where kids are playing. So you want to make sure that the compost is really high quality, that it's very fine in particle size, and that it doesn't have contaminants like glass or plastic, because people are interacting with those landscapes. Farmers also, by the way, don't want glass or plastic in their compost too. So high quality compost tends to be more expensive also. So there's all these trade-offs in thinking about that. So there's not necessarily an optimal compost or feedstocks for the compost, but it just depends on what the farmer's main goals are: nutrient, water retention, availability, cost, all of those things. But yeah, the feedstocks, how it's made, whether you're using large scale industrial thermophilic composting, or if you're using worms for vermicomposting, or small scale, those will have kind of differing properties of that finished compost also.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. The next two questions I will direct to Virginia. So the first question has to do with farmers being able to stay on their land. Is CDFA doing any policy work on increasing farm leases? 3-year grants are amazing, but if farmers can't even stay on land that long, how do they reap those benefits? So Virginia, welcome your response to this, or I know there's other state agencies maybe also working on land tenure as well.
Yeah, and actually there's currently a land equity force being coordinated by the Strategic Growth Council, and they're discussing a lot of these issues. These are leases between private individuals, so the mechanisms for intervening are not always that obvious. But what we have done, particularly through our State Department of Conservation and some of the programs that we have there, like the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, we are working with land trusts that are working to both permanently protect farmland, but then also work with landowners who are interested in either long-term leases, leasing to new and beginning farmers, doing a buy, protect, sell model where maybe the land trust buys the land, puts an easement on it, and then sells it back to somebody who wants to come into agriculture. So the state's made some significant investments in this area. I think the program has spent about $230 million in the last 10 years, if I'm remembering that right. But again, it does amount to a tiny little percentage of agricultural land. So I'm personally really looking forward to seeing the forthcoming report from the Land Equity Task Force and seeing what solutions they come up with. Did you ask me another question after that?
Great. No, that was great, Virginia. And I will drop the link in the chat for the draft report as well. And I think you mentioned this, but the task force is planning to release their final report by the end of the year, so we'll be able to see that in the new year. Okay, and the second question has to do with the climate resilience strategy for agriculture. What does implementation of the strategy look like for the next year, for the next 5 years? Any insights you can share, Virginia?
Yeah, I can share a lot of the actions that you'll see in the strategy are currently underway. There's plenty in there that we're currently doing right now. And so we will continue to do that. And it just kind of depends on what thing in there you're talking about. Some of the funding comes through the end of this year. Some of it is more long term. So it depends on the action. Proposition 4, again, is like really the big opportunity currently for things like healthy soils. We've got a couple rounds of that we're going to put out, and then those are multiple year grants. So we'll have about 5 years of implementation of some of those. There's also going to be a lot of suggestions for new things that we've received from the public. And so that is going to be dependent on the legislature to fund those things. And so it's our goal to lift up potential solutions in this document and really share with people the possibilities so that we can inspire some more investment in this area. But yeah, so kind of variety of answers. Some of it's happening, some of it's still to come.
Wonderful. Thank you. This next, oh wow, we have some great questions in the chat, and I am sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of these. The next one I will open up to either of you. This is a fun question. We have someone who's relatively new to the topic of agriculture and nature-based solutions. They're curious if you have any recommendations on where they can learn more. I know that's a big question, but any foundational readings or podcasts or resources that come to mind, folks to follow on Twitter? Yeah, how can this person learn more?
I like to listen to my boss a lot, and I promise that's not sucking up. She's really great. Like the Secretary Karen Ross, I would listen to any speech that she makes, and you will learn a lot. And then I always learn a lot from CDFA staff. So maybe that's just me, but what about you, Rebecca?
I actually also going to say CDFA is the place to go. So this is a really fast moving area of research and practice. And so there's not, in my opinion, there's not a good like textbook out there or kind of foundational text because we are growing it now. Maybe in 5 years that will exist. But right now there's not like a one-stop textbook to those kinds of things because it's just changing. If it was written this year, 2 years from now, it might be out of date already. But so I was going to say also, CDFA has a lot of really great documents that are accessible. They have some, very technical stuff, but they also have very accessible reports on these kinds of things. So I would definitely say, look at the CDFA website, listen to talks on YouTube that you can find for sure. And then for some, this isn't necessarily all nature-based science-based climate solutions, but Project Drawdown, which is a nonprofit that kind of tries to put numbers to all sorts of different climate solutions. They have a nice website and tool that you can kind of click around and compare how all of these different climate solutions work, and it's science-based. So that's another good source as well. I probably should have a good, I'm sure there's a good podcast out there, but I don't know.
Well, I was
Well,
thinking back to my UC Santa Cruz days, not to get competitive between UCs, but I'm a slug. And so I took classes from Dr. Steve Gleesman, and he had a textbook on it was either principles or fundamentals of agroecology. And that was a great primer on soil health strategies. So you might, if you really want a textbook, you might check that one out.
I
yeah.
agree. I give that one to my students for their class. Yes. So for, yeah, kind of basics of agroecology, the Gleesman book.
Thank you both so much for entertaining that question. And thank you for whoever posed that question for joining our webinar. The next question is related to pairing soil health education and practices with SIGMA, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, outreach and education related to that. So is there any pairing of these efforts that's happening to address mutual goals and outcomes? I will ask that to Virginia.
Yeah, not as much as there probably should be. We start to address this a bit in our climate resilience strategy. We have chapters on both healthy soils and on water. And so there are some, like certainly a lot of interconnection between the two. And maybe Dr. Ryals remembers these statistics better than me, but I think it's such an opportunity because we know that for every I'm going to say this and then you can correct me, but for every % increase in organic matter in soil, you see about 20,000 gallons per acre held. Did I get that close even?
That's the statistic that people, yeah,
Okay.
use. Yeah.
All right.
Context matters though, but so it could be less or more depending
Certainly.
on, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I imagine that if we had more robust adoption of healthy soils practices, then we could be addressing some of our water challenges too. And so I hope that people are making those connections more often in the future.
Wonderful.
I can add to that too, because we think a lot in the Central Valley about this question, because we're going to be pretty impacted by Sigma and potentially fallowing a lot of agricultural land. So then the question is, this multi-land use repurposing, like, is there a way to a more like kind of water wise way to use that and still keep it as productive land? I don't think there's an easy answer to that at all, but I feel lucky to be in California, to have CDFA, to have CARB, all of our state agencies that are kind of at the forefront of thinking about how these really challenging issues connect with each other to find the best solutions.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that as well, Rebecca. I think we have time for one final question. So this one relates to leveraging SB 279. So Virginia, does CDFA have plans to leverage SB 279 to optimize one-time large-scale woody biomass events like whole orchard removals to serve as an opportunity for local and decentralized compost production in order to help achieve state goals?
I'm not sure about the compost production part, but we did add a new practice in the last couple of years to our Healthy Soils program, which is whole orchard recycling. And so we now incentivize, if you've got an orchard that needs to be removed, we can help you pay to chip and incorporate those materials. I wish it was larger scale, and I wish more people were utilizing the practice. And so our goal has been really the last couple of years to get out the word that we've added that as an opportunity. And so tell everyone you know.
Wonderful. And thank you so much. With that, we are at time. So I thank the two panelists for joining us, as well as everyone else in the audience who was able to tune in today. Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year, and we'll see you in January. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.